This is the third video from Chapter A. I'll be talking today about perfect intervals. I'm going to share my screen with you. Perfect intervals account for only a few of the interval sizes that we talked about last time. The four sizes of intervals that are typically perfect are the unison, the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. As long as we stay in a single key signature, for instance, the key signature of C major, which has no sharps or flats, these intervals will always be perfect. These perfect intervals are all diatonic. They are made up of, as I said, notes that belong together in the same key signature. Here are some other unisons and octaves, except now I have used sharps and flats to make the intervals either a half step bigger or a half a step smaller. When a perfect interval is made a half a step larger, it becomes augmented. And if a perfect interval becomes a half a step smaller, it is diminished. We use the plus sign for augmented and a small circle like the symbol for degree for diminished. While I had a G to G above, now I have a G to G sharp. It still is a unison because it's going from a G to a G. It only spans one line on the staff. But it is now an augmented unison. If I spelled the second note as an A flat, it would no longer be a unison. It would be a second, and it would be an interval that is enharmonically equivalent to this augmented unison. More about that later. One of the questions that I pose in the paragraph on the screen is, do you think that a unison can become diminished? Could we have a diminished unison? The answer is no, we can't, because you can't get two notes any closer to each other than being the same note. We'd have to, turn musical space inside out or something like that in order to have that happen. Now look at the octaves on the screen. I took the D to D perfect octave from above, and I added a sharp or a flat to the upper or lower note to make the interval either larger or smaller. Notice that the sharps and flats have different effects on the intervals depending on whether they're on the upper or lower note. When the top note is a D sharp, that makes the interval larger. But a D sharp on the bottom, as in the last measure here, actually makes the interval smaller. When we have a flat on the top note, that makes the interval smaller, so D natural up to D flat is a diminished octave. But if the flat is on the lower note, that makes it augmented. For many of you, this will seem to be self-evident, but I know that this is also confusing for some students. It seems to be a bit of an assumption that if a flat is involved, it must be making the interval smaller. No, if the flat is on the top note, it makes it smaller. But if the flat's on the bottom note, it's actually stretching it out. Okay, let's move on to fourths and fifths. Fourths and fifths, again, basically come in one size. When we're in a key, the fourths and the fifths that we encounter are almost all perfect fourths and perfect fifths. But even using the notes of one key signature, it turns out that there's going to be one exception for each of those interval sizes. So let's take a look at the C major scale, which I've written for you on the staff. I've marked in with these bent lines where the half steps are. The half steps are between E and F, B and C, and again, a higher E and F. And just for those of you who need the reference, here's a piano keyboard, and it's reminding you that there's no black key between E and F, and that's why that's a half step. There's no black key between B and C, and that's why that's a half step. So now let's look at the fifths over here in this measure. The interval from C to G is a perfect fifth, and you can see that a perfect fifth has a whole step, a half step, and another whole step. So in order to be a perfect fifth, the fifth has to have 3 whole steps and 1 half step. 3 1/2 steps, or if you will, 7 half steps. Listen to a recording that I made on MIDI of all of these fifths. You're going to hear that each one pretty much sounds like the others, but when we get to the last one, the diminished fifth sounds a lot different. Take a look at that last fifth that we have here, the fifth from B up to F. Notice that this fifth has a half step from B to C, then it has a whole step, another whole step, and then another half step. In other words, this fifth from B to F is not 3.5 steps. It's 2 whole steps and 2 half steps. In other words, it is 3 steps or 6 half steps. That's why it's a half a step smaller than any of the other fifths in the key of C major. So the moral of the story is that when you're looking at natural notes and the intervals that they form, you can pretty much count on all of the fifths being perfect, except if both the note B and the note F are involved, and in that case you have a diminished fifth. Now let's take a look at the staff below that shows the perfect fourths. The same thing is going to be true here. Most of the fourths in the key of C major are perfect fourths. And if you take a look, for instance, at, let's take the fourth from C up to F. That fourth has a whole step, and then a half step. And that would be true of all of these perfect fourths. There are 2 whole steps plus 1 half step in some order in those perfect fourths. There is, however, one place in the C major scale where if we have a span of 4 letter names, we will not have any half step. And that's to be found right here between F and B. We have 1, 2, 3 whole steps, and that's why the fourth from F up to B is bigger than those other ones. It is an augmented fourth. Listen to the sound of these 7 fourths and hear how the augmented fourth at the end sounds different. I have a few concepts to introduce with this screen before I move on. First of all, I want to use the word inversion to refer to intervals, and we'll be talking more about this in a future lecture. I've more or less lined up the perfect fourths underneath the perfect fifths, and you can see that the intervals that are above and below each other are actually the upside down versions of each other. Up here, there's a fifth, which is a C, and above it, a G. If I turn it upside down and I move the G below the C, or I could do it the other way too, I could move the C above the G, what I would have is a perfect fourth. So we can say that the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth are related to each other by inversion. They both involve the same notes, at least the same notes as we call them by their letter name. But while the perfect fifth goes from a C4 to a G4, the perfect fourth would go from a C4 down to a G3. The diminished fifth here on the right end of the staff inverts into the augmented fourth. A general principle is that perfect intervals invert into other perfect intervals, but diminished intervals invert into augmented intervals, and augmented intervals invert into diminished intervals. I want to introduce another term here, which is the word tritone, Tritone. Technically, a tritone is an augmented fourth. The reason that we call the augmented fourth a tritone is that it consists of 3, that's the tri, whole steps, that's the tone. So a tritone is 3 whole steps. In practice, when we use the word tritone, it often also refers to the diminished fifth. And the reason is that the diminished fifth, which is 2 whole steps plus 2 half steps, is also an interval that consists of 3 whole steps. Turns out that the diminished fifth and the augmented fourth are both the same size. They're 6 half steps big. They are 2 enharmonically equivalent intervals. So when you think of the word tritone, remember that it refers to especially an augmented fourth, but also a diminished fifth, which is the same size. That does it for this third lecture from chapter A. We still have to talk about seconds and thirds, and then we have to talk about sixths and sevenths. We'll do that in subsequent lectures.